breaking convention not only because of the shorter travel times than usual, but also because the last breaking convention for me in 2017 was actually my first ever academic conference, and with that also my first psychedelic conference. And with all the ceremonial aspects that it had, it did feel like an initiation rite of sorts into that community that exists around psychedelic research. And these themes, the role of ceremony, of the feeling of community, of psychedelics, and the relationship between these is what I'm going to explore in my talk now. Although not focusing on academic conferences, but on psychedelic ceremonies. Specifically, we have investigated the role of intersubjective experience during ceremonies, focusing here on a concept called communitas, which stems from social anthropological research and has so far been left untouched mostly by psychological sciences. So to start with, what is communitas? Communitas is a concept that has first been investigated and introduced by Victor and Edith Turner, a couple of cultural anthropologists who have in the 1950s spent several years living among a Central African tribe and studying the ritual process. And that is also really the starting point for the development of the concept communitas, which denotes an anti-structured or unstructured relational mode between the individuals of a community that can arise in a specific phase in rites of passage, in rituals, and is characterized by collective feelings of joy, of harmony, of togetherness. These phases, these in-between stages in rites of passage called liminal phases, are stemming from research by a French ethnographer, Arnold van Gennep, that's now almost 100 years ago, who thought of rites of passage as a threefold process. So first you have a separation of the community or of an individual from the fixed point in social structure, leading into this in-between, this twixt and between this liminal stage in the process. And a transformative event happens there, giving that individuum or the whole collective a new social order, followed by a reintegration into that new structure. So an example I like to give here is that of high school graduation, which might in most Western societies be the closest that we still get to the transition of the child into adulthood, this rite of passage into maturity. So in this transitional phase where all the papers are handed in, all the exams are written, but the graduation hasn't happened yet, students are not really in the role of students anymore, and teachers are not really in their role as teachers anymore. So these kind of power relationships are all of a sudden revoked. And when these individuals engage with each other, they might be able to relate to each other on a more deeper, maybe personal level, just seeing each other as people rather than in that teacher-student relationship. And this is kind of the idea of liminality, where status is revoked and unstructured relational mode can arise that lets human connect on a different type of level. So another example for this is for the seasonal rite of passage that we celebrate as Carnival, as the transition from winter to summer, which also gives a nice kind of example of how status reversal happens in our Western societies during rites of passage, where the weak and marginalized, the gestures, can take control, and the usually powerful are mocked and ridiculed during this specific liminal stage. A more local example here from London is Extinction Rebellion and the occupation of several spaces here in central London earlier in April this year. Many of you probably know about it or have been there. That also drew a lot from ceremonial and ritual processes and created these transitional, fluid social bodies in which people seem to engage on a really radically different level than you normally expect in the alienated central London atmosphere. So I'm sure some of these guys also read their Turner. Now, making quite a jump from central London to the Amazon, you might not be surprised that also ayahuasca ceremonies have been conceptualized within that framework of communitas and liminality. Especially here, the concept of ayahuasca travel, which in itself resembles a sort of pilgrimage often, characterized by this separation of the Western traveler from his fixed point in his social-cultural realm, going on this more or less strenuous journey into a radically different environment and culture where over a course of time, a ceremony or a series of ceremonies demarks this transformative event, then usually followed by a reintegration, a flight back into the structure where that individual came from. The social anthropologist Evgenia Fotiu makes this quite explicit when she writes in her dissertation, ayahuasca rituals are conceptualized as a liminal, transformative experience that contributes to the transformation of the self by providing the space to experience communitas and reflect. This is not a ritual that reproduces social order. Rather, the ingestion of a powerful hallucinogen provides the ideal instrument of critique of mainstream culture by challenging basic cultural assumptions about oneself and the world, stressing here the disruptive potential of liminal and communitas experiences. So these types of experiences seem to be ever more popular, leading to an increase in the number of commercial retreats offering psychedelic ceremonies to paying customers, leading to even phenomena like Aya Advisors, which works like TripAdvisor but for ayahuasca retreats, or Aya Coin, ayahuasca's own cryptocurrency, which will then allow you to pay anonymously for the psychedelic services that are provided. First, here a little graph on Google searches for ayahuasca retreats over the last 10 years. You see like a really drastic increase, which is also disproportionate to the interest in psychedelics in general. So this is in orange, the interest in psychedelic experiences, and in blue, in ayahuasca retreats. So there seems to be a disproportionate increase in the interest in retreat settings. But we don't even have to look that far. Just 5 hours with the Eurostar Express from here in the Netherlands, we see an expanding market segment of truffle retreats, of psilocybin truffle retreats. So this is the situation how it was about 2 years ago, and then over the past 2 years, numerous other service providers have showed up that offer different levels of care and standards. And you might not be surprised that the publication of Michael Pollan's widely successful book, How I Changed Your Mind, coincided with a drastic spike in the interest in psychedelic retreats. So from the perspective of a researcher, this is, of course, a very interesting development, as it gives us the opportunity to study these semi-structured settings of psychedelic use, of collective psychedelic use, in a kind of large-scale way. So by getting in touch with psychedelic service providers and retreats, we can collect data from their participants. Here in the study, we focused on the role of social experience and what that plays in, during retreats, as it is something that's quite exclusive and quite unique when comparing that to, for example, the clinical or laboratory studies that we're running, as these are usually conducted as an individual journey. So the hypothesis here was that similar to the mystical experience or challenging experiences that we know to be predictive of long-term psychological outcomes, we're thinking that also the experience of communitas during ceremony could be a predictor of well-being changes from before to after a ceremony or a retreat. We tested this by developing and validating a psychometric scale for communitas that was adapted from previous research actually on a very different type of experience on the golf course and in nightclubbing, and ran a large-scale prospective online study on retreat participants. We did so by essentially recruiting psychedelic retreats and ayahuasca retreats in South America, and asking them to invite their participants to sign up for our study. So we got a large sample from several individual retreat centers around the world. The design of the study itself was that we first sent out a questionnaire to the retreat center itself, to the facilitators, to see how exactly they conduct ceremony and what their retreats are looking like. And then when they invited their own participants, those got a baseline questionnaire from us 2 weeks before the ceremony or retreat experience that collected a large set of psychological and trait variables, as well as information about their intention to participate in the retreat, followed by a state or set questionnaire within the 24 hours preceding the first ceremony of a retreat. that collected data on the feelings of preparedness and readiness to go into the ceremony at that point. Then came the actual ceremony, followed on the next day by a questionnaire tapping into the acute subjective psychedelic experience, so things like mystical experience, ego dissolution, and of course what we're interested here, communitas. These were then repeated for each ceremony of a retreat, as in many cases in ayahuasca retreats especially, you have multiple ceremonies over the course of a single retreat. This was then followed by a post-retreat questionnaire a day after finishing the entire retreat, and endpoints 2 and 4 weeks after ceremony. Followed by a follow-up questionnaire 6 and 12 months later, which I'm only mentioned briefly as we don't have that much data yet on those time points. So looking at the sample, we had, at the time of analysis, 480 people almost who completed the baseline questionnaire, and then a large attrition, which is kind of expected in these observational designs, as many people will start engaging with the first questionnaires but then drop out as, for example, it's too much effort for them, or they're traveling in South America and they don't feel like sitting in front of a computer or in front of their phones, which is completely understandable. We also made paper versions of the questionnaires available to people, at least for the pre and the post-ceremony questionnaires, which are within the retreat environment, so that at least they didn't have to engage with any digital media while they were present at the retreat. The substances that we investigated are a wide range, but mostly we saw that about 3/4 of the sample here came from psilocybin retreats with mushrooms or truffle, and 1/4 to 1/3 from ayahuasca retreats. The demographics of the sample are quite unique when comparing them to other psychedelic studies. So it was fairly gender balanced. The age was much higher than you'd usually see in such observational studies on psychedelic use. So the average age was 43, as opposed to usually people in the 20s that you see signing up for such naturalistic studies on psychedelic use. Interestingly also, almost a majority of the participants that we had signing up were psychedelic naive, so 40% of them never had a psychedelic experience before, showing that these environments do seem to attract the demographic that is a bit older and might not be that experienced with psychedelics, but is looking for a safe and structured environment to have potentially their first psychedelic experience in. So people, in a way, from without the regular psychedelic community who got interested, probably also a lot through Michael Pollan's book in psychedelic retreats. So this is the communitas questionnaire, the scale that we were using. The first 5 items are adapted from previous work, and the latter 3 added by my colleague Leah Roseman, who's also sitting here in the audience. The item that was rated the highest of all those was during ceremony I felt that social status became irrelevant, followed by I experienced all participants as equal based on basic shared humanity, and then during ceremony I felt a sense of harmony with the others. So just to give an idea of what exactly this questionnaire was measuring. Running a factor analysis on this, we saw that the items were highly intercorrelated. They showed excellent internal consistency. But now what does this scale actually measure? To tap into that, we ran a series of validation analyses comparing the communitas scale to other acute experience measures, tapping into both social experience and individual experience. So to tie it in with existing validated measures of intersubjective experience, we use the identity fusion scale that you can see here, which tries to measure a sense of unity, of identification with the group while retaining individual selfhood, and the emotional synchrony scale, which measures a collective effervescence and emotional attunement between those that are participating in ceremony. So this is to measure convergent validity. You'd expect a high correlation between communitas and these scales. To measure divergent validity or discriminant validity, we'd have to find conceptually unrelated constructs, which is not exactly easy given that the concept of communitas does have a high overlap with mystical type experience, for example, or ego dissolution experience. So we used questionnaires on challenging visual, emotional, and mystical aspects of the individual experience, as well as emotional ego dissolution and ego inflation questionnaires. So yeah, just to note, you would expect a a proper discriminant validity probably only with visual experience and challenging experiences here as ego dissolution and mystic experience probably has some conceptual overlap with communitas. Looking at the set of correlations between communitas, which is here in the top row, and all these acute experiences scales and their subscales, you do see, as expected, a high correlation in the upper left corner between communitas and the other social experience scales, so emotional synchrony and identity fusion. Also fairly high correlations with the subscales of the mystical experience questionnaire. And ego dissolution, proper discriminant validity was only achieved for subscales of the challenging experience questionnaire, whereas the experience of isolation and paranoia even correlated negatively with experience of communitas, which also conceptually makes sense. So this shows face validity of the communitas scale, meaning that these, the social dimension of psychedelic ceremonies does seem to be fairly coherent and reliably measurable complex. The question now, of course, becomes, what does this social component imply? How does it affect long-term outcomes? So here we looked at predictive validity. This is the increase in well-being and in social connectedness measured with the What's Connectedness scale from before to 2 weeks, 4 weeks, and 6 months after ceremony. You can see highly significant increases with large effect sizes that are even sustained even 6 months after a psychedelic retreat. Now, interestingly, the experience of communitas was correlated with the increase from baseline to just 2 weeks after the ceremony in both of these scales, in psychological well-being and in the feelings of connectedness to others, meaning that the experience of communitas during ceremony did have a predictive power on the long-term psychological changes that people showed from before to after the retreat. Now, the last question that we were asking is whether we would be able to also predict the occurrence of communitas during ceremony based on the sense of preparedness and the setting that people would find themselves in when undergoing ceremony. Specifically, we did this by running a set of regression models with intentions that people had for going into ceremonies, with psychological traits, and the sense of preparedness measured right before ceremony. In green here, you can see those factors that positively predict the occurrence of experience of communitas for the individual. And on the other hand, some concurrent factors that you'd find during ceremony, specifically the number of participants during ceremony, the substance that was used, either psilocybin or ayahuasca, and the dose used, measured just by a subjective report of low, medium, or high dose. Unfortunately, this being an observational design, we have very little access to actually have a reliable measure of the dose that people were taking during ceremony or given. And then a number of setting elements. Here, the perceived influence of recorded music, of ritual objects during ceremony, of chanting, ritual fire, distractions, perceived threats, and the presence of supportive individuals, as well as some active setting elements, so the active participation in chanting, sharing circles, group meditations, dancing, and conversations. The R-squared values here indicate how much of the variance in communitas was explained by the specific set of predictors. So just to note here, the highest amount of variance was explained by the setting factors, meaning that those had the highest predictive power on the experience of communitas. Then including all the significant variables here and reducing that model until everything came out as predictive, we were left with a final model that explained about 40% of the variance, including having spiritual intentions to go into the retreat, the rapport, so the relationship built with those people who were participating and the facilitators, as well as the presence of recorded music, of chanting, and supportive individuals, which was the strongest factor in predicting communitas. And the experience of perceived threat during ceremony had a negative effect on communitas. So in summary, we were able to predict, based on set and setting, the acute psychedelic experience here, the intersubjective psychedelic experience, which then in turn predicted long-term outcomes, here specifically the experience of well-being and the increase of well-being and increase in social connectedness. So intentions, preparations, ritual design, and most strongly the experience of the presence of supportive individuals did contribute to the emergence of communitas during ceremony. What are the implications of this? Well, first of all, this study gives some first empirical evidence on that there are certain non-reducible factors in ceremonial and collective settings that may have therapeutic implications. So coming from a more clinical and laboratory background, this raises the question whether it might not make sense to also explore other formats than the individual journey in kind of psychedelic-assisted treatments. Something like psychedelic-assisted group therapy might not only come with its own intrinsic benefits, but also potentially reduce the costs of psychedelic-assisted treatments and thereby increase the accessibility. Another question, and mostly uncharted territory so far, is what happens between the acute experience and long-term outcomes. This phase, that's often talked about as integration, can, in Van Gennep's model, perhaps be conceived as the phase of reincorporation, the post-liminal phase, what happens after that transitional, that transformative process, how are people coming back into their regular world, into their everyday life, and asking questions like how we can assist people to land back in the realities of their everyday lives and implement some of the insights that they may have had during that retreat. So yeah, it's not easy to answer how people are able to weave in these profound experiences that may really alter and change their conception of reality and of themselves into their personal individual narratives and the way that they relate with others and see the world. But already Victor Turner was aware that the benefits of liminality depend on a sense of being public, of being shared with others. So the idea that we create meaning through engagement, through telling our story, through sharing our experience with others. And this, in societies where psychedelics and plant medicines are still largely stigmatized and criminalized, is not easy for people who do not have the community surrounding them that is open to psychedelics, as many here will have. So on that note, I think it might make sense to extend our definition of what we understand at set and setting from beyond that restricted space of what happens during a retreat or what happens during a psychedelic experience to the values and norms of the sociocultural realm that either the individual or that space is embedded within, as probably also those will have an effect on how people integrate the experiences that they have acutely. One last thing, please consider visiting our homepage, psychedelicsurvey.com, where we're hosting the ceremony study and also other observational research studies. So if you're planning to take a psychedelic, either in a microdosing format or just by yourself or at a festival even, there are studies for that, as well as, of course, if you're planning to participate in a psychedelic retreat, feel welcome to sign up for the ceremony study. So thank you for your attention.